Ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else, and even every more than one else, maybe you can help me with something. Here's my problem. Aside from a lack of Dogecoin, I also don't know what the hell a Jill Nephew is. I mean, I've seen one of them swimming around integral meme reefs and metamodern spirituality shoals. I know they're endemic to the natural intelligence regions, but I can't say for sure I really know what one is. So here to help me figure out what's a Jill Nephew is Jill Nephew. Hi, Jill.
Hi. Your intros are classic.
Yeah, it's ironic for me because I hate introductions.
Really?
Yeah, I got like I don't want to. I don't like to be introduced. I won't sit through the opening credits of movies. I just want to skip to the thing. So this is my way of fighting back.
Yeah, fight the power, whatever that power may be. The power of introductions. Oppressive introductions.
Oh,
boxes.
I know.
Here's the box.
I'm just so worried about the framing being inadequate to the content. It's like you pick up a volume of Plutarch and you got to put up with 30 pages of some mediocre academic pre-explaining to you what it's going to be. And by then you've lost your contact with the ancient complexity of it.
Yeah. Well, I think you did a really good job of opening that up. Like there was a lot of words in there without closing me down. I get to just be a representative of an entity I didn't know was a plurality of. So there's that thought experiment to do. Do you fry a lot of your guest brains, or just like, well,
it's fun to go in with that rollicking opening. I think sometimes a lot of them are just like feel like they're done, like, okay, well, that covered everything.
Right.
Because I do want to kind of sum up the obvious things they would say, but also catch them not off guard exactly, but make sure that I'm not going down a prescribed track. I have swag outside of the horse blinders that one would expect from a conversation.
Great. That's great. You have that control. Yeah. So.
Okay, Jill.
Yes.
Where were you born and what kind of landscapes imprinted them on you most interestingly when you were young?
That's an interesting starter question. You mean actual geographic landscapes?
Yeah. What do you remember from your environment?
Interesting. We're starting pretty. I didn't think we'd start there. Okay. I was born in Palo Alto, and there's a lot to say about that. If I wanted to buy my house today that my parents sold in the 70s, I'd need to come up with $6 million. So I was born right in the heart of Palo Alto. And, my landscapes were full of things like building, plant, tree. I mean, those are, the early abstractions. But I think, I don't know if we'll cut all this. I don't know if it's really going to get anywhere to where we're going. But I think my youth was a little curious because I asked my dad at a pretty young age, like, there's a path in front of our house. What happens if I take it all the way in one direction, all the way in the other? And the answer I got was, if you take it all the way to the south, you'll end up in Hollywood. And I said, what's Hollywood? He's like, well, that's where all the stuff that comes out of television is made, which I was fascinated. Like, oh, I want to be one of those people that come out of television. And then the other direction, what about the other direction to the north? He said, that's Alaska, where there's no more people. And I was like, oh, that's even better. The land where there's nobody. And I was just tortured me. So that was my map. My early map was there's this weird home thing, which is fun, but then there's the great adventure, which is either Hollywood or Alaska. And I think
halfway between the dream factory and the wilderness.
Yeah. You're either going to try to be the broadcaster of this madness, or you got to get away from it. So,
well, I could see some connecting threads there. There's stuff around imagination and stuff around frontiers in the work you've been doing, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and having an outsider view and trying to get under the code. Yeah. So no, it definitely set it. It definitely set the stage. I mean, if I really wanted to connect it up, I have connected it up for real. My dad explained to me all the existential givens as an appropriate young age, which I actually talked to Brendan about. That I think it kind of kicked me out of the normal stage theory evolution to be considering death at an infant stage. And that kind of had me come out not understanding why people aren't talking about big, important, hard questions. And like, this just seemed like the most obvious thing. If you learn about existential givens before you understand anything else about social enculturation or life pressures or anything. I didn't learn about cavities till like 2 years later. I was horrified. Like, I cried a lot more about finding out there's rotten in my teeth could happen than knowing I was going to die, because it's still so abstract. It's like, oh, I'm just going back where I came from. Well, okay, well, what are we all doing here? And why isn't anybody talking about it? That sense stuck with me in a really deep way of like, that's obviously wrong. That never stopped feeling wrong, that we can't sit down and have a conversation about the existential givens. So that's the more direct, I think, connection between trying to
do you have kids?
No.
Okay. Yeah. So you haven't been in the situation where you decide when to introduce that existential givens conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, I would love to go back in time, time machine, interview my dad. Like, what were you thinking? Why did you do that? What did you think would happen? I kind of have some ideas that he was an SRI scientist and he was a free thinker. And I think he very much valued and wanted me to be a free thinker. So I think he felt like that was probably getting me off to a good start to never lie to me. And I probably stumbled on it and he just wasn't going to hold back. So
I cautiously approve.
Yeah, right. You probably get to see more how the sausage is made than I will ever know.
So there's this whole, talking to you is going to go around this concept of natural intelligence, which sounds to me like a mix of Gurdjieff Taoism and computers. What is natural intelligence as opposed to any other kind of intelligence?
Yeah, right. Well, I'm glad we're starting there. I think it's the most important thing I have to say. So people trail off at this point, if they get the most important message first. I was looking for a frame that I thought wouldn't get destroyed by the internet. So I was looking for something that was pointing at, that I thought was the appropriate term that was already scientifically, had a scientific grounding that couldn't be destroyed. So I feel like sense making was this interesting term that was like, there was already a meaning making literature, and you could talk about making sense a little bit in the scientific literature, but you couldn't really do sense making in the scientific literature. You only really showed up in organizational sense making. And so I think it was vulnerable to people just kind of drifting with it. And so with natural intelligence, it's already kind of come up where people have said, well, you don't really mean what I see when I wiki it or look into science literature. You mean some other natural intelligence. And we're saying, no, we mean exactly that one. We mean the scientific one. And it's a very loose definition. It's not saying how you do it. It's saying it is the proof in the pudding is that things that exercise it can live. And so, if we think of humanity collectively, like the fact that we're threatening our own survival, and the fact that we threaten our survival, from the nuclear war is the most arguable, concrete example of the madness of like, cannot possibly be naturally intelligent. Something else must be happening. So with that frame, the idea is that we are in these existential crises because, where we're recognizing threatening our own future survival as not the target state. And we'll know that we're at the target state of restoring what we should intrinsically know how to do, because every living creature does. We will restore something we've lost or learn how to bring it to the next level or have it. It ultimately needs to win out to whatever we're doing right now that got us to where we are. So I liked it as a frame because it's a target state you can't falsify the doing of it. You would say, if you don't feel like we're all at threat collectively or individually, then we arrived at the target state. If we aren't in crisis anymore, we did the right thing. So that gives us this agility kind of, and as a company to say we're orienting around that. So that as a company, the mission can stay alive and then we can adjust to whatever the means are to reach that target as we learn. And yeah, so I know you're formulating a question, but I can also, if you need more crosscuts into what I think it is.
Please.
Well, I was going to say some other ways to anchor it. Okay, so that's very abstract. And then if I want to start to anchor it of how I think other people are talking about it, there's various things that have large intersecting Venn diagrams on it, which I think are in some ways what John Vervaeke talks at is relevance realization, what the outcome might be of religion is not a religion, the idea of wisdom, wisdom as a state. And the most strong anchoring, which we talk about in the site, is if you're looking for signals of what might be undermining it, the left hemisphere capture is a really obvious mechanism that completely correlates very well and ties very well, like a strongest hypothesis of something you could address, that this Ian McGilchrist hypothesis. That's what is moving us away from it. So if you were to fix what Ian McGilchrist is pointing at, we would say you've restored the wholeness that is our full natural intelligence.
Lots of different ways to go with that.
I know. And there's one more crosscut, so you can pick your favorite,
Okay.
which is that, and this is the really important part. This is the work of Judea Pearl, collaging with original work on conceptual blends, really recognizing that counterfactual reasoning is our highest form of cognition, and that kind of imaginal work, emotional, affective, imaginal work, the whole stack, right, is reliable. It's not in that stack where the unreliability comes in, but that's what the unreliableness has been blamed on. And so we've been trusting this rationality, which is very consistent with the left hemisphere, but actually the big revolution in the sciences, which Judea Pearl points out, is that left hemisphere that is closed system reasoning is not generative of anything new, and it's not the foundation of the scientific method, and it's not scientific. All it can do is confabulate. It can't be in touch with reality. It can't do the process of grounding and testing hypotheses or formulating new ones. So it's a very non-scientific stance, but we've thought it's more scientific. So we've got this huge confusion going on from 20th century science that's really where we completely don't even understand how powerful our minds are because we're not using them right. So that's a really big, thing that is going to eventually, if truth prevails, truer prevails, will be, ripple through and down because that's absolutely falsifying all kinds of garbage at the forefront of modern cognitive science, 21st century cognitive science.
This, in the McGilchrist sense, however neuroarchitectural or metaphorical that turns out to be, we have this system that's been doing a kind of narrow rationalizing instead of what we hope reason and science really is. And it's not only created a narrow and false version of reality, but it's stuck in a trap whereby it detects a problem and tries to correct that problem by doing more of itself rather than bringing in any other kind of cognitive process.
Right, it can do that. Right. Yeah. But when it's trapped, that's its quality. Exactly. And it doesn't know it.
And this is upstream of the meaning crisis and the sense-making crisis. And that needs to be corrected by deactivating, sidestepping, or switching, which involves some kind of recognition of false modes, as well as some kind of affirmation of certain cognitive mechanisms that we've seen elucidated in cognitive science over the past few decades.
Right.
Now, my curiosity is around those mechanisms. What would you say are like the core set of cognitive science insights that you think are really essential to having our natural intelligence function more competently?
Well, that's a great question. And I think, let's see, what do I think of? Let me back up a little bit and versus narrowing it to core insights, which I can do, might pick my favorites, but I do want to say, kind of set a little bit more the stage of that. When I discovered Ian McGilchrist's work, which was recently, I very much echoed, I had a book draft, I had my version of his work as a book draft because I was so curious about all the places this has showed up.
Yeah.
So I just find it a very useful description of what has been recognized in so many ways. So even the idea of what the hemispheric capture, the direct experience of it is like a dream state, maybe what we call being asleep to something that, it's very synonymous that you're stuck in something. You don't have access to signals that remind you're stuck. That's by definition, the state when it's trapped, you don't know it. Like, unless you learn to do metacognitive processes, you can become lucid in dreaming. You can, work with your dream states, and you could set timers and you can do things to snap out of it. But I do want to point out, that there's not just one like kind of core insight. There's a giant wealth of research that shows the same thing over and over and over and over. And so if you kind of abstract it out, like you said, let's not worry about the neurobiology, because that was just handy for him to do a controlled study and particularly establish, which is really important, that the confabulation is localized to the trapped process. Because a lot of people, if you look at the work of Wilson and Nisbet from 77 and all the stuff about Stranger to Yourself, his work, most people probably walking around would think that confabulation, that delusion goes all the way down the stack, that it's part of the subconscious, whatever that is, the non-conscious, and that and that once it becomes rational, you've snapped out of the delusion. And this is weirdly, it's kind of the opposite. So I think that's like really a big deal. And that's a felt sense big deal for people to get out of the habit of that. Like we've been indoctrinated with this at every angle. So I think, yeah, back to your point, though, I think what is really an important insight in general from the sciences is that when people recognize the Imig-Gilchrist model, their first insight might be to balance it. And then we have integral world, right, which says integrate, right? And we would say that you don't want to balance it so much of like so you've got two attention systems, right? One is deciding this is what's important. That's not necessarily invalid. It's likely valid that you're trapped in our experience. It's trustworthy that the thing that captures your attention is a valuable signal. It's just that its model has the quality of trapping you. That's our hypothesis, and then how to back up all that is books and blah blah blah. But that the quality of the model is what keeps you trapped. And what is it that forces that trapping? There's lots of things that can force you also to constrict and be in that, to construct on the fly a model that's trapping. So what you'd want to do, and then you have your diffuse attention. So what you often do with a lot of meditation, spiritual practices, is you say, well, look, trapped attention has a certain quality. It's analytic, it's kind of aggressive, it's fearful, it's got, it's tense, it's got all these qualities. And then we have this idea, like everything else, we just call like the spiritual. So if we just can connect with anything in our body and our senses and our breath and a different belief, anything, we'll get out of that state. And so that's kind of like the idea of balancing it. It's just like, and even if you can get yourself to do that, just what's called like the distancing. There's a lot of literature around distancing. And of course, from Gurdjieff work, all about like, you're almost always trying to distance, but this idea of taking a distance perspective will do a lot to restore context. Like when you're really close in, it's easier to get lost in these loops. And just if you can get yourself the distance, often that's enough to ground this. So what we say is the important thing is not to balance the hemispheres, but to take what's trapped and try to ground that content. So stay with it. So I think other people point out that's kind of consistent with Tantra. I don't know. I'm not a Tantra person, but the idea that you would stay with something. But I think how it deviates from Tantra, or at least what we would say deviates from Tantra, what we've done a lot of work to elucidate, another kind of meta-core insight, is the trustworthiness of the mind to do that work for you. Like you have senses that are your mind's trying to fix itself. It's trying to do that. So you can, work with a whole giant swath of what we're kind of framing as cognitive senses to know how to trust yourself in that process to get to ground that. And there's a lot of messages out there that have you not trust that by kind of just manhandling it, strong arming it and not trusting the mind process. And so you see that with basically saying, well, like, let's just call that constant of mind or monkey mind or narrative, or we'll just dismiss it because of the qualities of it, instead of saying, well, you can actually work with that and break it out of the narrative and reground it. So inquiry basically is in the name. Meditative inquiry, anything with open-ended inquiry, we think is the unsung hero. And I guess maybe I should say what I think of unsung heroes, and we could back out how the science backs that up. But basically that the open-ended question forms presented correctly, all this is kind of like a catalytic experiment. If you do any part wrong, it won't happen. But if you get all the parts right, it happens. So there's a variety of things you have to get right. But if you get them all right, the languaging, there's certain languaging that creates that coordination. And that is an inquiry. So a style of inquiry that basically an inquiry can have a quality of attention that's opening. So, and I think, so right now there's a lot of muddying that language is language. And there hasn't been much people that study language forms of inquiry to realize that you can't really say the same things about inquiry. Like people think, oh, language narrative. But if I just say, how do you feel right now? Or what is your, we steer attention with inquiry, so we're using language in a different way. And I think that's really important to recognize that if you map language onto what it's doing functionally, which I know you think a lot about, that you kind of have to do that with fresh eyes here to take in what part of language is doing what part of what. I'll stop there. I think giving you plenty.
Yeah, one thing is I'm hearing the word grounded come up a lot, and I'm curious. You must have a lot of rich associations with that word, when you think of it, beyond just a kind of quasi-tantric staying with a feeling quality, what else are you thinking of when you think of grounding?
Oh yeah, that's a really great question. I don't know if I say that tantric staying with feeling is grounding. I would say that very much grounding means that you've done it correctly when you stop thinking. So that should be, so in some sense, the process should feel like an insight process where the thing that's bothering you evaporates and you return to a quieter place. So that's the signal of it. Insight process, more clarity, a recognition that what was in the content of your mind is less true, and a recognition that you understand something that feels more true, but the more trueness of it may not be remarkable, or it may just be like an extinction. And so to me, grounding is just a better alignment with your model of reality and reality. So it could involve layers of deconstruction, reconstruction, reformulation. It might involve new concept creation, which then needs to go through a whole nother process, and relanguaging, where you might have hypotheses formulate that now can be the next target of inquiry. But yeah, there's a movement. But I think it's that there's a lot of cognitive felt senses to doing grounding. And so very aligned with the Gurdjieff work, if you're choosing because you believe it's somehow strategically, beneficial to preferentially place your attention on some part of the stack, be it your physicality, your emotionality, your cognition, that's, you have to ask who's the one choosing and where did that model come from? Because these things can be, you can just follow mind through this process. You can, if you follow the right part, follow your senses, the right senses, not the, follow your senses instead of follow the associations, basically, which is not so, easy.
That grounded condition, however profound or simple, direct it might be, as true as the fact that the pavement gets wet when it rains. Do you think of that more as a return or as a production of the system? Are we returning to our underlying condition, or are we accomplishing something in that moment?
Well, I mean, basically when you're bothered, which is what we try to address, right? We kind of like that as an abstraction, that when your attention system's captured, something bothers you, and then you notice thinking, and you get stuck in thinking, and then that's where your attention is, and it can hog all the attention. So you do feel like you're disconnected from your life while that's happening. So when that stops happening, you reconnect to your life and everything that kind of comes along with it. So in that sense, it might feel like a return, but you may not come out, it's a transformative process every time. Like memory is always different. Everything's always different. The models deconstruct and reconstruct all the time. And if you're using the tools we've been working on, you can actually kind of model that and watch that happen. You can check in and say, well, here's my current model of reality, and let me, track it. You'll see like there's times it goes dead, and you can see how parts collapse or the whole thing collapses and where did it go, and is this new things emerge. And so there's kind of this, you can start to, if it's not already obvious, you can start to see that the larger scale models are kind of in flux. So in that way, yeah, it's I don't want to gloss over. So that's a way to talk about it. But I think the deeper returning is a really important point. And I think that would be fun for us to talk about, actually. So the nature of what the software we built does is it tries to work as an artificial memory in a meaningful way, so that when you're in these inquiries, you also get prompted with things that aren't your normal associations. So things that you left for your own breadcrumbs. So your mind's associative. It's very Gurdjieffian again. There's a lot of Gurdjieffian stuff in there. I was like, thanks, Gurdjieff. I studied him as a very young person, and I'm kind of astounded how much he's holding up. But that you have your normal associations. That's how the mind works, by mood and by time and by situation and circumstance. And you can completely not add up, like there's no reason why your whole life should add up. It's not really, that's not on this organism, not really designed for that. If you're not in the business of having these vague uneasinesses and leaning into those, from distant parts of the map kind of haunting you, you're probably maybe, can drink those away or whatever and never even notice that there's a problem. But if you're in the habit of like leaning into those deep uneasinesses, you start realizing that I can be in all these different parts of the map with different associations. And so you can start to play games where you leave yourself breadcrumbs around the map. And then you can bring those things back to mind from different parts of the map and try to get at a meta map and start to try to integrate across this maze-like experience. And that's quite an intense process, because every time, you pull one of those off, you get dissonance. And that becomes the seat of generation of insight, and also, and if nothing else, a calm seat of equanimity. Both could be true without having to resolve into a new truth. It would just be a perspective of understanding a more nuanced, perspective on things. So you can do this little breadcrumb process. And this is the fun part, is that if you read Francis Yates' Art of Memory by any chance? Yeah, do you remember the part? I know it's a lot about memory, but a whole bunch of it, a little chunk is about Giordano Bruno's and the art of truth. Have you guys ever talked about that? I haven't heard all your work, but gone into that at all?
Only very vaguely, but I'll tell you, when I asked Brendan what he would like to double click on from your conversation, he said more about the art of truth.
Yeah, I think that would be the fun one for the integral stage, right? Oh, we could totally get geeky on this. I've been on the hunt to try to figure out if Gurdjieff knew about these things. So I kind of stumbled into Inqwire in a sense. Like I built this thing trying to build a better tacit knowledge extraction system to try to take wisdom out of old people and give it to us poor young people. That was like kind of the naive model. So I was going after like really good open-ended questions that would try to get at the really meaningful, important stuff in people's lives. And then I collected that all into a model, and it became this whole little engine. And then I started
going to automate the elder transmission process.
That was the idea, but there's a lot to say about that too. That was slightly misguided. I think a lot of people still think of the transmission model. Let's just shelf that one, right? So, I built this engine, and at the time, it's bigger now, but at the time, for me to QA test it, I had to run some very simple model of my life through about 750 questions where they're colliding in different ways, just to make sure I got the verbiage right. And that was the first iteration of the thing. That took me a few weeks, and that's where I was kind of blown away, and I had to rethink what I just built, because every 20 minutes or so I was having a pretty wild insight that I just kind of have to bellow and cry a little bit, then get back to work. And I was trying not to have insights. Like, it's dreadful doing QA. I was just trying to like read the sentence. Is the sentence is that grammatically correct? And I'd be like, oh my God, I never made the connection that, I was a paraglidar pilot, and it was just this common sense stuff about my life. And yet it was so rich with insight in the collisions. And I was like, wow, what was that? And then people were commenting the difference in me. This was 10 years ago. So I feel like I'm due for some other version of it again. But people were like, you obviously, are different now. And I felt as though it was very obvious to me that I had collected myself, and in a way that I hadn't felt collected. And this is also, memoir writers talk about this. They say that they go in to just reveal the truth of their life. That's the pure motivation for you to sit down and try to write your memoirs. You want to get to the truth of your life. And they say, just write out the snippets, this and that, and then lay it all out on the floor, like you read how to do a memoir, and just start moving things around, look for themes. And so they're doing a lot of this like collisional, outside the maze, right, insight process. And afterwards, they universally pretty much say, yeah, it gives you a new lease on life. It's deeply transformative. And I feel like that's a great, really important thing to really try to emphasize, that this is like, it's so hard to find anything that's not placebo effect in the psyche. So if you have a group of community that's not going in for a transformative life effect experience, going in to try to publish a book, for posterity or whatever, or because they feel it, and then they come out saying, I have a new lease on life, and you should just expect that. And they say, you won't refer to your memory anymore. You'll refer to the memoir. So the memoir becomes a more trustworthy source of their memory, which is interesting. So they construct this very trustworthy source. So we have that piece. And so I built this thing. And then I was on a friend of mine's podcast like 5 years ago, and he had another guest on there who heard my podcast and said, I think I know what you might have built. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he sent me the Francis Yates work, and he had really been interested in the art of truth work, and actually wrote a fiction book about what if someone came up with one modern day, which is fun. Anneal It by Eric, it's not Geiger Renzer, Eric Geiger. I can put it in show notes, but if anyone's curious about his book. And so what is that? And so the idea is that if you look at the idea of the art of truth, art of memory, the idea is that the art of memory is just saying we externalize mind all the time to leverage, like extended memory is some of our superpower technologically. Like it's a big deal. And so all these symbol systems are, the thing behind you, this is how we extend our mind and make ourselves more powerful, but they're static and they're symbolic. And the art of truth is the idea presumably invented in the 1200s by Raymond Lull. Some people recognize as the first information technologist and and theologian. So, let's just say that's possible, even though it'd be like it's tech bros and theologians, a little harder to collage in this modern day. But anyway,
well, the word alchemy used to cover all that stuff,
right? So we had tech bro, the original tech bro theologian, and so the idea there was that instead of capturing symbol systems, you capture the compartments that the symbols go into, and people create your own symbol system. But on top of that, you do a meta-categorization of the symbol system, and then you do it as concentric paper rings so that you rotate them around and make these non-obvious combinations. So now we're just talking about an insight machine, right? And there's all these ideas for how to build them, and supposedly they're very widespread. The problem is if you mess around with them, you start deconstructing power structures. And so they were underground, forbidden, and systematically destroyed as best that they could with the church. And, Raymond Lull did them and realized that he could go convince Muslims that God was good and got stoned to death. And then Giordano Bruno tried to convince the King of Spain he should be doing it. And then he got, killed by the Inquisition. So you definitely you want to double check your inspiration behind your insight process. May not end well. And so it's been interesting for me to look at the kind of the original works. I am not a historian at all, but I feel like having built one, I could read the Giordano Bruno work. Had one piece he wrote where he's kind of explaining how it works, and you look at this book and it just seems like absolute nonsense. And you hear them talking about it, and they basically, very maybe even metamodern. I don't think there's irony, but they basically said, look, this is how I decode his book. So you'll see concentric rings that have A, B, C, D, like maybe the Kabbalah, like very abstract symbol systems, in the concentric rings. And then in the same book, he'll have this whole giant chapter where he talks about all these number 37, I'm just making this up, for example, I don't have these memorized at all, but like the symbol of the ox means that the heavens will come down and your ox will be healthy. And it's just like, what is this? It's just like these indices, right? Of like this for this one, and all these little stories. And at the very end of the book, he said, and so what you would do with these things basically is you would line them up. Here's my theory. They thought that they were basically encrypting ways to deprogram your brain. So that's that the insights are going to deprogram your brain, right? And have you see through the propaganda, the illusion that you're trapped in right now, that is the power structures. And so you would align you'd have a little code that says, outer ring B, inner ring C, next ring D, the king, imagine as a pauper, in the times of this. Now, what do you think of him? Like, whoa, I never thought he is as a man, but I guess I could imagine that, like breaking out of these indoctrination and this brainwashing, right? And so you could share these things, these combinations. And what I thought was interesting is the reason I think part of the clues of this might be true is the last page of the book kind of talks about, and if they're coming for you and the streets are running red with, then write everything upside down, like make everything upside down. So it's like one last encoding that if you were to line up things in the different encoding upside down, you would have one more layer of encryption. So it's kind of like these signals of how to encrypt them. And what's interesting to me is the one of the chapters in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson is particularly cryptic when it comes to these 7 rings. And Giordano Bruno had 7 rings, and mentioning in his groups that anybody that knows how these things work knows enough to not explain it to other people how it works. And so I don't know if there's something there about where it went historically, but I think, if I didn't bury the punchline too much, I probably did, that the lore around them was that you would reduce the chaos in your mind, unifying your thinking, at which point your soul would return. So it's this unifying, integrating process.
There's
So
so
you
many
dump your
resonances with that.
yeah.
Thinking of my dad got me this Aleister Crowley book when I was 12 or 13. It was just sets of connections. It was just like jade goes with the number this, goes with this metal, right? It was all just for doing spells, but it was nonlinear sets of resonant connections that you wouldn't expect. Which led me to a whole bunch of interesting thinking on the time. But I'm thinking about Deleuze and Guattari and the notion of escaping from control systems by constant deterritorialization out of the containers. I'm thinking of William Burroughs and the kind of psychic effects that were generated by his cut-up collage techniques of writing that he used in the 40s and 50s.
Oh, I didn't know about that. I'd be curious about that.
And there's a connection there. He and I guess Brian Geisen, who he was working with, they were very excited by a similar kind of thing that these older alchemists were excited by, which is not just that we can do this process inside ourselves, but there might be an external quasi-mechanical way of automating the process of unexpected conjunctions, which obviously we would do digitally now, but is necessarily a part of our extended mind if we take an extended mind view of things.
Yeah, and I think that this chopping up is really important. I don't know if you that made me Freeassociate to one of the last Castaneda books where he talked about a dream exercise, where you look around the dream to try to anchor the dream. So you basically just pick 5 different objects in the dream and you look around them very rapidly, and then they become concrete and the dream transforms. And I actually did that exercise and it was really radical. Like it really was like, whoa, I literally was in the dream. My eyes went open and I was looking at my wall in the dream with the same salience of reality experience. So, it makes sense now from cognitive, kind of thinking about what you're doing, that, we have this fluidity, mind isn't static, it's fluid. And so you make an association, it kind of drifts away and you can't hold that many things. And it's got this drifty fluid. So when you start to anchor it these different ways, a lot of magic starts happening. And if you start to do these combinations, so you think about the fact that you can only hold so many things in your mind, you can scan a list of many, many, many things. So you can find patterns and insights when you start to externalize it you would never find through association. You just can't hold that many. So that's really interesting. The recognition along larger instances can be really a undeniable insight where you just, has a deeper quality.
My girlfriend and I have this habit of whoever's making dinner, the other person reads aloud.
Aww.
And this week we were doing the original Surrealist manifestos by André Breton. And one of the things that stuck out to me was that it's the same time, right? It's Gurdjieff writing Beelzebub's Paris tale in Paris at that same moment. And it's an extremely surrealistic text. But their whole principle is that they're going to achieve a surrealism, a hyper reality, by these unexpected conjunctions. And the guy who created it said, beauty has to be as beautiful as the chance meeting of a sewing machine and an umbrella on a dissecting table. That was the original statement of the Surrealist movement.
Oh.
So this sense of these unexpected conjunctions that operate from, in my thinking, different subsystems within us are able to splice and produce some additional quality that we can use to either experience the numinous or reconfigure ourselves.
Right. And I think that that brings up a couple of really good points. Let me make sure I'm ready to move on to those points if there was anything left over there. I do want to kind of anchor that splicing thing into, like you were saying, I'm curious about when you look at what narrative is, how it, we should definitely, if someday, if not in this conversation, we really should talk about narrative, but this kind of linguistic quality of being able to spin causality and intentions into, connected concepts. And if you just simply chop those up, you can start to loosen things up for grounding. Just if you can just chop up the part that forces the causality. So you have all the right pieces, maybe, or at least the pieces can, be there minus the causality. So you kind of, if you start listening for that, you hear that that's present in a lot of a lot of different modes that get people unstuck. So it's like a chopping, particularly at those points. But when you said the surrealist movement, and yeah, I think that's really interesting to collage that with Ian McGilchrist's commentary that we are in a time where, AI can do that. So and it is, like Dali, I don't know if anyone's covered that, but it's kind of the death of surrealism, probably, that you have an AI that can go surreal on you like nobody's business. You just come up with a sentence and it'll do the art for you. And if you do the math on, all the possible associations you could make, it's combinatorially explosive. So now we're kind of coming back to John Vervaeke's relevance realization problem, that there's something more happening than just random scrambling. And I think that fascination, the left hemisphere loves novelty. And so you're just new models, and you'll never have to ground any of them. It's like, oh, a little spark of novelty. Like, that's an interesting model. That's an interesting model, and nothing that knows how to do something else that gets at that grounds it. So, so it's a little bit of a, I think you can get lost in that. That's my sense. You can get lost in that.
Well, it needs some other feature to it. I mean, one of the things that popped up for me when you were speaking earlier was the way that discipline and things like karma yoga function in the East, where you're going to, let's say I'm going to chant a mantra all day, or let's say I'm going to a party, but I'm going to put a rock in my shoe, or there's all these different ways that you're given a discipline or instruction that are quasi-arbitrary, but they force an additional point of focus that's going to cause interesting conjunctions with the rest of your attentional activities. And that element of intentionality and activating our intention circuits, that seems to be essential in navigating that relationship between the left and the right. And I would associate that with the notion of constraint that I know is a big feature of a lot of your thinking, because we can unfold all kinds of different models, and they sort of, like our own thing, it'll just go and go and go and go and go until you make some kind of a cut or some kind of a gesture or do some additional thing on purpose.
Right. And I think this is really a great point to come to, because obviously it's kind of the core of the business you might be up to in a lot of Gurdjieff schools. The practice, the work to just set up artificial memories, artificial practices, break up habits, try to be less crystallizing, the concept of crystallizing, you just want to not be crystallized. And I think that, well, I shouldn't say I think that, let's slow down on this a bit. So, we're kind of launching from the point of the arbitrariness of it. And that when you had kind of asserted that there's a necessary component to breaking out of a habit or something to turn something on that lets something new happen. Like it's like a mindfulness supplement, like a growth powder, like you want to be mindful. Well, here's all these extra ways you can remember to use your attention in some different way. I'm kind of shelving that off to the side as not actually necessarily being important, because until you're through the stack of all the things your mind already is trying to get you to figure out because they bother you. So it's kind of like in our formulation, there's no monkey mind. That's all the stuff you chose to ignore. And for whatever reason, there's lots of reasons we ignore ourselves. So, what are you trying to break yourself out of? Well, that's where you should start. Why are you not feeling directly alive in the moment already? That's what could possibly be in the way to do the move to just get out of it. There's lots of ways out of it, but you're still doing this kind of invalidating move against the trapped attention system. Like, we don't like how it feels. We kind of vilified it. And we want to be in the state of it leaving us alone. We miss our lives. We love feeling lively. And so we kind of have this adversarial relationship to the thinking part of our minds. And the argument here is to work with that in a different way. So that's kind of the practice we're really trying to promote as a relatively, I think a relatively new way to try to get at things. I mean, if you can see the pieces. So like I said, a lot of Inqwire is about synthesis. So we could break down the layers of how to do that, and you'll recognize practices that maybe do various layers of this stack, but there's a stack you can go through to where you are trying to digest all that. So, and that's kind of, I think, consistent with a lot of the Gurdjieff work too, is ultimately you're trying to digest this, trying to transform. You're not trying to, and you're not even trying to break it up. You're trying to do something else. It's very much about that. It's very cryptically, but very much points out constantly a digestion model. It's like that. It's like this is what you're supposed to assimilate. That is what your real experiences are locked up in. That is a mirror of the culture, and that is a mirror of the pain you hold. It's a mirror of everything. It's not arbitrary. It's what you banged into, you internalized, and you have to metabolize it. And so that's work, right? That's cognitive work, imaginative work, to do all the steps of trying to calm it down. And so it's a little bit more of a patience model, like thinking that rather than strong arming at all the states we crave, these deeper embodied, present, lively, would ensue. And that with them, what would that be like? That would be what would the unification feel like? What would that full integration feel like? Like if, theoretically, right, the culmination should be in every moment of your life. It doesn't feel profound to be aware in every single moment of your death and your place and everything you love and why you're doing what you're doing. Like, these things would be continuous. They don't have to be salient, but if you look for them, the stars are still shining through. It doesn't cloud over. If you want to look deeper, you see deeper. If you encounter anything living, you feel it. You can feel into its experience. It opens to you. There's not walls to it. And of course, we get threatened all the time, and then we pull back. And we have to deal with that, and we aren't in that state. And so that's the constant art of living, is to, digest that, try to predict better, try to navigate away from threat, and just do our best. So it's kind of acknowledging that whole process of like, threat, what was that? Oh, okay, I see what that is. And then back to life. And kind of.
Yeah, I appreciate that distinction between, working with what's salient because some part of you is bringing it up, versus quasi-arbitrary elements that come in from more classical spiritual systems.
Right.
Like if there's if a person has a mantra, for example, right, and they can be wherever their attention is going into contracted mode, they can restore an expanded mode by articulating a thought that's been arbitrarily pre-decided, that's lighter and easier and less contracted, right? This is how transcendental meditation operates.
Uh-huh.
But as nice as that is, it doesn't afford you the additional opportunity of making your own sense out of things by doing it in a way that's connected to what's actually arising for you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I agree. Like, I think that's where I don't want to, I'm not trying to dismiss it out of hand. What are you really doing when you do these things where you're bringing in reminders, factors, right? Is that you are trying to do real-time integration. And I think what I'd like to unpack and understand, especially in the next couple of years, I think it's going to be really important. That's very hard, because to do the integration work, the insight work, and there's a lot of cognitive science behind this, like solitude is the name of the game. Like, it's imaginal work. It's very hard to be trying to do it while you're doing living. And at times when I have tried to do both simultaneously, it's hard to not come off as maybe artistic or detached or quirky or surrealistic, or like, you have to present kind of you can't really, you can't really blend so easily if you're also stepping out. And of course, that's the name of the game of the Gurdjieff work, is to try to make that imperceptible, so that people would never guess you have a spiritual practice. You're kind of flattered. People suggest you meditate or something, that you're making the layers so thin, you're not changing anything. And yet somehow you're able to do something that isn't at least derailed if you would want to try to start to mess with that layer. Yeah, so I think that it almost feels like something we'd workshop. These are a lot of incomplete thoughts of mine of like, what is the place of choosing to try to do a persistent, distanced, real-time, integrative
Yeah, and where do we make place for that in our lives, and where do we make a place for that in the society? It reminds me of a thing Nietzsche said this about in his analysis of the history of ascetic practices. He imagines the original shaman, who's also the original philosopher and the original whole bunch of things, existing in a society of people who have to live in an extremely rough way relative to the world and each other. And in order to get the internal space they need, the shaman has to create all kinds of uncanny affect, right? You gotta do your meditation in the graveyard and put a bone through your nose or something like that, so that the other warriors go, holy shit, okay, maybe you deserve to have a little space by yourself, where you're not just a failure to do what we're doing, you're just as creepy as we are. Please continue to have your silence.
Right. Yeah. I mean, mourning and covering yourself in black, like that's such a beautiful, tradition we forgot, knowing how to ask for space like that.
Yeah.
But I think in a funner, spicier way, my kind of putting aside how people are currently practicing and whether or not that's detrimental or beneficial, which is where the jury's out for me actually on which way it ultimately falls, is set you back towards this goal of integration by just, you're wasting a lot of time kind of generating interesting but not so useful models, and kind of maybe slightly screwing up your social relationships by acting weird. Like feeling like do you want to be distanced in real life? I think that's a big open question too, because like what you really crave is to be absolutely intimate and embedded and embodied.
To what degree is it sabotaging all the things that you get value from, and to what degree is it practicing the proto skills necessary for these other practices?
That's right. Yeah. So like, do you want to, I think it was an interesting experiment for Gurdjieffian to say, let's just try practicing all the time in real life, and I think those of us that have done those experiments, it's pretty, it's a trip. I'll leave it at that. So, but I will say that here's where I think is really completely underutilized as psychotechnology, but I think that our technology could facilitate, or anything like it, which is probably what Gurdjieff is pointing out, sacred theater, that people come together and that they make imaginable space to embody these, what is relevant. So you would construct, you construct thought experiments that are embodied, basically. Thought experiments are incredibly powerful and useful. This is what I started talking about. Like, we were very good at learning by doing thought experiments and hypothetical counterfactual reasoning. But that's still, playing it out in your imagination. Well, you can play it out embodied with other people. You can run scenarios. And if you do it embodied, I've done a lot of theater work, sampled a lot of different techniques, and the amount of potential for doing that married with this idea of what's arising. But not with this ham-handed approach of fixing. You have to escape the broken 20th century therapy models that are like everywhere. That they got some idea of how they're going to fix you. They don't understand that the point is that you just naturally let the insights happen, and you don't know it's an insight. That's the whole point of insight. You don't know what's going to happen. It just, what will happen is supposed to happen because it's ultimately grounds into reality. So there's no point predicting it. Nobody can predict it. You just have to let it happen. And so anybody that thinks they're going to, guide it or have it go a certain way, or even have a theory of this is getting at this trauma and you're healing this thing, or you're going to represent these things and replay it this way, I think is, I would just like to see, I'd like to see that measured against a pure insight process to believe that they're adding and not taking away. They might be adding. I would just like to see that measured.
Yeah. And, and in a variety of different styles. So you can figure out whether some ways of doing that are adding or subtracting. That's one of the things that's always stood out to me. Like, I haven't yet come across an internal practice whose instructions can't be taken in at least two diametrical opposite directions, right? Two people sit down and they say, for example, two Zen monks sit down, and the instruction is focus your attention on the essence of the mind. Right? And so they both do this for an hour. At the end of the hour, they both tell you with the same words that they both did that practice. And yet one of them might be thinking about the unbound spaciousness of the background of the mind, and the other one might be thinking about distinction itself as the mind essence, right? And they can both go, look, the mind essence is Buddha. I focused on it for an hour. Did you? Yeah, I did too. Right. And so, but over time, you could have extremely divergent or extremely convergent results from these tiny little differences in practice that haven't been mapped very well. And almost any practice instruction can be done in at least several different ways that you would assume would lead to cumulative differentials over time.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think also it's there's just a lot of presumption in practice generation, and we've been really well. I mean, this kind of gets to one of the main things I wanted to kind of talk about with everybody, with the world, conversation with the world, starting with you, the first person I brought this up to that isn't my co-founder, which is that I think that we have a real. So yeah, let me step back. Sorry, I'm going to kind of hijack this a little bit because I want to set a little bit more of a frame, which is that there was a meme that showed up on your Facebook feed, which was the liminal web, someone drowning, and then this high five, and then but wait. And that's of course the criticism of what we're doing and what a lot of people are doing is that this is fun and I think it's not to be overlooked the huge win that we can all that we all are tolerating each other beyond tolerating each other. We're learning how to enrich each other, as you put it. That's a huge win. And then I think that the criticism is coming. It's like, okay, we did that for a couple of years, but come on, you guys, like, if not you, who is going to lead into something? Like, aren't we kind of proclaiming anyway that we're the ones that are going to lead into something, the fertile bed that's going to lead to something that's going to help? And what I wanted to kind of say for the record, and maybe people can challenge me on this because this is a little bit contentious, and I want it to be contentious. It's kind of is that we need more contention. Okay, but a very specific kind. And I want to say that here's the map. This whole thing I led with that we misunderstood science in the 20th century as rationality, reductive data first. There's lots of people who are still logical. The majority views logical positivism with science and the actual practicing of it. If you kind of get under, they may not, if you get under and ask them, what is science? What is scientific method? It's establishing what we know based on data. And then I'd say it's absolutely not science based on 21st century cognitive science. 21st century cognitive science would say it's the process of understanding by virtue of like realizing the falseness of your models and grounding them into reality. Scientists just put their attention on something weird that we don't all pay attention to, and then they try to communicate what they understand. And that's where I think the Feynman quote coming in is that philosophy of science is as useful to physicists as ornithology is to birds. He's saying, if you actually do science, all you're trying to do is understand something and you're going to throw everything you can at it. There's all kinds of methodologies. And so I am privileged enough to have done undergrad in physics, published in soft condensed matter physics, which is an overlap of kind of chemistry and physics, did graduate work in biophysics, then the graduate work again in atmospheric climate science. And then worked in engineering and AI. And so I had a foot in those worlds as a researcher. And so I was very into operations research and AI research level stuff. And I'd say all those sciences, which is just a subset that I touched on, all have different methodologies and different ways that they come to understand. But they all are somewhat guilty of generalizing, and that these philosophers of science often will go study one field and say this is how science works. It's like, no, it works different in every field because you're just taking a human. No one told me how to do science in any of those fields. Nobody sat me down and said, here's how to do science. Never had a class on how to do science. I published papers in physics journals as a first author, which is very hard to do. And no one told me how to do science before doing that. They said, try to understand this. And I had to convince people that I understood it. That's it. So I think where we get in trouble, to me, 21st century science, we're done with reductive science. I think that's pretty much dead. Like, we built all the machines we can build. We figured out all the math we can that works. We're staring at nature and real world systems, living systems, completely nowhere, way beyond our depths. We're never going to get it. It's just no. It's so complicated. There's no, you don't approach it that way. But Earth science is an N of one system. So you aren't doing random control trials. You aren't doing experiments with control. you do get to understand things. You do get to understand things. You apply principles you know from physics, chemistry, geology, all of it, biology, to the Earth system. And you get to say things, and we build Earth models, and they work, and they're predictive where they can be. And so we have this whole relationship to working with open understanding to the best of our ability and knowing how to negotiate that. And that, to me, is this actual science. And that's what we have to return to. So who's privileged to do that? And our argument is that every human being can do that. That is the natural intelligence process. If you couldn't do it, you'd die. If you can't try to understand what's in front of you and ground it into reality, you will not live. So everybody is a natural born scientist. Scientists are people that we have paid to go study something weird, and we believe they're doing it impartially, and now we're learning they're not. But the incentives are messed up. And we're kind of being caught with our pants down. The academy's failing us like crazy right now, especially the psychological sciences, where people are really getting hurt and damaged because they aren't doing good enough science and they aren't incentivized to. So, and that's a whole nother thing, but that's my invitation to say, I believe that I heard you in an earlier podcast say, you know, how could you synthesize the science with this? And I believe that there's no domain of human understanding that is immune from what we should call real science, and that that process, including the traditional science, bring all that in. But in 20th century, with the way, and this is very much Judea Pearl's work, if you want to understand what this is about, the problem with data-based science is that you can make up all kinds of confabulations. It's closed system science. You can make up all of these interpretations. And the science of the 20th century didn't even demand that. They just wanted data. So like all psychiatrists wanted data. Psychiatry just wanted data. All of many psychological, studies, including mindfulness, you do one randomly controlled trial, which isn't even controlled. And you just get data. Everybody in the trial is expecting their outcomes. You haven't controlled for placebo effect. Nobody does that. So you've got this massive pile of what could be majority bad science. So I believe it's imperative that some community take on that has the right incentives. The process of not trying to come up with a new novel theory, but to clean up. It's kind of the Bilber model, right? It's time for us to grow up and clean up their mess on behalf of the world, because we can. We absolutely can. We can carefully do it. And there's plenty of people that have the professional background to help us with all the actual, if this community brought together all of its collective knowledge of all the science they practice and could come outside of that and be critical, I think that some community could do a really good job of starting to synthesize and clean that up.
There's a real opportunity there. And I think the fact that this cluster of liminal communities is very focused around some version of becoming, right? Whether it's Wilber's evolution or whether it's the Hegelian dialectic or something like that, something akin to a process of ongoing self-refinement is at the axis of all these models. So it makes them available to something like this. When you were saying that, I thought about, I don't know if you ever read any Galileo, but all his writings are like Plato. They're in little vignettes, right? He essentially wrote plays where somebody has the old view and somebody has the new view, and then a third person goes, I'm not sure, convince me. And at the beginning of one of his plays, he talks about his new view of science, which is basically error correction. And so he's like, the only place I'm interested in is wherever my hypothesis turned out to be incorrect. If you want to understand anything, that's the only place that's of interest to you.
Yeah.
But it's not just for a Galileo caliber thinker. It's obviously something that's built into the entire system. Nassim Taleb talks a lot about this, about how, right, we're stuck in the modeling part of the mind. And then if we build AIs based on the modeling system, we're going to get a faulty thing, because that's not how a panther learns to haul a dead gazelle up a tree, which is an incredibly difficult task, right? It just learned it by doing it and getting feedback to something that mattered. So we have to be able to understand the necessity of those kind of immersive learning experiences, this ongoing self-correction mechanism as fundamental to every one of the domains and as being the thing that enables the integration because it's common to all the domains. And then we have to be able to somehow prove that we can do it, prove that it works. I just had a great conversation with Greg Henriquez around therapeutic authority was a part of it, right? So if the therapist has been getting their authority from some kind of weird alliance with the pharmaceutical medical profession bureaucracies up till now, where is the new therapist going to get their authority? Well, it's got to be from either the coherence of their philosophy and or the fact that they're getting better results. And they're only getting better results if they're doing better science in some sense. And if we can think of that better science as being done in all these domains of the mandala, then we essentially have an integrative model that should be able to be more efficacious in the world, which would be its fundamental justification.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I want to add one more layer to that. And I do want to dog ear or Mark or whatever come back to the therapeutic authority. That's a really interesting point, which is that I don't think we're throwing out the science of the 20th century. I think we're just scrutinizing it carefully because there's some great science, right? So I think that this is where I don't think there's a reinventing the wheel necessarily. We might have all the pieces, right? Because the different fields, there's another thing is the science is so siloed. So a lot of what I did with the project with Inqwire, if you will go to the site and look at our science page, I really had to read all that it came up. It was like, well, I better understand this field, that field, that field. And there's all these fields and they all give a piece of the puzzle. So there's already an existing mandala and a lot of work to integrate that. So I feel like that's where I would love to see very, work groups, funded work groups where people carefully say, I want to challenge what you just said and let's schedule it. I'm going to reference it and we're going to read the articles, we're going to read the criticisms, we're going to read the whole history. We might even talk to that scientist and we're going to get to the bottom of this. Like, I think that can be done. This process at start can go really deep. And then as so one thing that came out of doing this process is that I felt as though Inqwire became almost fully constrained. I have very few questions open. And this is another way coming into these conversations is a little awkward because I hear all the questions that come up from I should say, this is an important point. It wasn't just the scientific crosscut. I would observe something in the software because we were experimenting. We had an experimental test harness. We had a machine we can give people in private, not knowing anything they're talking about, and they could do their own basically self-therapy process. And we could collect metadata on it that told us nothing about them personally, and they asked them what was going on. So we could do all these kind of experiments that can't be done in normal therapy. We could do a new class of experiments with this Inqwire technology that hadn't been done before. We could do them very rapidly. So we did a lot of, it was all pretty much all learning by doing, and then seeing something and then trying to see what scientists had talked about it. That was the process. Like, okay, great, because I want to know if anyone's talked about this and I need to be able to speak to this. And, it's much better if someone's already done it. So that was the process that we went through. And so through that process of learning by doing and working on the technology and using the existing science, there aren't as many, another Feynman quote, like the thing's always simpler than you think it is. like it ended up being, when I hear people talk about all the way they're imagining to build things that could service, what people are imagining into the original Islamic religions or relevance realization or, even a metamodern spirituality, I feel as though I can map it out in a tighter, smaller system from having built a working prototype of an insight machine and beyond. And so I think that that's a demonstration of the kind of work that could be done. It's very, and people have talked about how would you get this work funded, that people could carefully try to build psychotechnologies with better methodology that's kind of based on this like rapid experimentation, testing, trying to understand, ground it in the science, look for contradictions, test for contradictions, basically do the job the scientists aren't doing, right? And I think that also the EPRC, the Daniel Ingram's group, or it's not really the group that he's part of, have also had a hard time getting their research funded, even though they have world-class scientists. They're having to fund it independently to study meditative states and whatnot. So that's what I'd love to see formalism, knowing that it doesn't mean we're doing not 20th century science, it's 21st century science. But it's still doesn't negate the science, the 20th century science.
Well, that sounds good.
Yeah, okay, good, great. So we'll do that. There we go.
Yeah, let's just get on that.
Schedule for next
I'll
week.
just throw that switch and we'll do it.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I mean, like, what's in the way, right? So it's like, what's in the way? That's the vision. That'd be my vision for what I've been craving, what I've been wanting for a lot of what I've been hearing going on is a way to bring in some way to make distinction, discernments, discriminations that are not don't feel like analytic, but feel like it's not reductive, right?
Yeah.
It's science that's not reductive. It's science. It's earth science is not reductive. Earth science just says that's nonsense to think that you can extract everything from the planet and still have a working life support system. Like science can tell you that this is nonsense. It doesn't tell you what to do. It tells you what not to do. The
possibility of technologizing it or kind of instrumentalizing the process to the point where it can be used by almost anyone. That seems to be key, because throughout the 20th century and even before, everybody would agree that the great scientists were doing something different, right? That they were going through these processes, but the rest of us were working on some kind of functional utilitarian teamwork science machine, right? So I think that's where it has to show up. The idea that you can just take somebody out of grad school as a technician and put them to work doing this process somehow. I think that would be transformative.
Which process are you referring to of doing the science?
Yeah, just this bringing this kind of processing to science, this kind of embodied experimental contradiction seeking and resolving think tank that's more than just thinking.
That's right. Yeah, that the idea is that we exercise our collective natural intelligence to look for like the incongruencies that are the fertile grounds of generative insights towards moving us forward. The problems, basically collective problem solving or collective, insight
we're
process.
Either, because of the nature of cognitive dissonance, we either lean into it on purpose or we're automatically kind of shuffled away from it, right? There's a process that goes on where people don't like those contradictions inside themselves. When they run into incongruities, it's like running into a pressure bubble. You sort of automatically surf away from the pressure, right? So unless we make a point of saying, I want to see incongruities, we'll probably automatically filter them out.
Oh, I get to respectfully disagree.
Okay.
That's interesting. So you have to tease those apart. That's why I think this would be like a great example of if we don't bore people to death, or we'd really slow down on the science there, right? And so there's kind of the backfire effect idea that people lean into their cognitive biases, and that if you try to put them on things, they kind of strengthen their position, and that's been falsified. So, but it's still widespread belief. But basically, all that can be grounded into the tribalism. You know, if you look for the effect of tribalism and social effects, tons of social effects that are not controlled for in general in psychological experiments ever. And so if you start controlling for them, you have to throw a ton of them out or reinterpret a bunch of them. So that'd be one where, you know, when people are alone, they love dissonance. If they didn't love dissonance, they'd be dead. You know, they get curious, right? There's fear of a thing that you don't understand. And then as soon as you feel like, wait, that doesn't add up, that's the head cock, you know,
right.
And it's actually pleasurable. It's like, what? Yeah, surprise. It's like, I got to go check that out. Like, that's dissonance. That's dissonance once you're over the fear.
Okay.
You're with another person where you don't
cognitive dissonance so much as social cognitive dissonance.
Well, you know, when you're social, you got to agree or we're going to kill each other, because that's what humans do. Like at a tribal level, if I start signaling I'm out group, you know, and we're competing for the same resource, we're going to try to kill each other. So we have to, signaling in-group out-group is life or death for us crazy.
This reminds me of the
animals.
marshmallow experiment. Yeah,
that one got falsified too, right?
Yeah, exactly. It turned out to be like, if you don't trust the people bringing you the marshmallows, you should eat the first one.
Right? That's natural intelligence. Like, yeah, exactly. There's a really nice paper by Newell and Shanks where it kind of just does this tour de force about 5 years ago saying, you know, this is everywhere. This is whole confusion. And this comes back to that confabulatory thing, right? Where we know we confabulate if we're under threat, that engages the threat network constricts. It doesn't, that's what our focus attention's for. I used to say before I heard Ian McGilchrist's analogy for it, it's like I called it my 2 claws, 1 mouth model. Like I got to model 3 things to live right now. That's it. Like, and I got to model them really well. Like, where are your claws and where is your mouth? And that's all I care about, And okay, a little bit of, are you gonna push me over the back of a cliff? But then back to the claws and the mouth, So if you're under threat, you're not building expansive models, right? And if you so nothing in all these cognitive experiments to see if we're crazy did anybody control for confabulation that was induced by the experimental setup. So I kind of I've been playing around with this term, but it's not scientific, of induced confabulation due to the experimental setup. And so an example of this is like the 1977 famous nylon experiment, where this is the start of this whole, there were crazy stuff that turned into stranger of yourself and all that, is that these women were shown, there's a little stand, and there's pantyhose, and there are 4 pantyhose examples, and they're identical. I think they were set in a grid or something, and they said, which one's the best? And people always said the last one they were shown, bottom right, was the best. They said, that's ridiculous, they're all the same. So that's how you see how we are, we're crazy. And then this fellow Geiger-Renzer, I think it's Geiger-Renzer, might have been White, I forget. In early 90s, they redid the experiment. And instead they asked an open-ended question, like after that, like, which one's the best? And they said, that one. And they said, I'm just curious, what's behind your answer? And they said, well, obviously they're all the same, but I don't want to make you uncomfortable. Like, I don't know what you're doing here. So I'm just like, I don't know, this one, I'll pick the last one. And they were kind of reading into it like, well, and they picked the bottom right one. So that must be a cognitive thing where it's like, why the bottom right? If it were truly random, they would have picked any, but that shows that we make up things. And pretty much everybody's just like, that one.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
It's one of the things at the bare minimum use of something like a Ken Wilber 4-grid graph is like, you should be remembering all 4 of these domains when you're interpreting information at all times.
Right. Am I crazy or are you crazy?
Are we both crazy? You got a psychological thing, you got a sociological thing, and then you have pure system dynamics. They're all in play here.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Then you have the emergent, even in the best case scenario. And then we can talk about that in a whole different thing too, of like, why interpret the emergent as being intrinsic, and that's a mess.
The part where the people are able to give the answer to why they were going down to the bottom right is fascinating, because there's so many missing questions, right? It's like if you look at that kind of Daniel Kahneman system 1, system 2 thing, it's not that system 1 is just giving you some arbitrary, useless answer. It's actually answering a different question. And there's so many areas in which the result that seems like a bad result is actually the result of a different question that you weren't thinking of when you arranged the circumstance of the experiment.
Yeah, like, how do I make this person feel comfortable? How do I give them the answer they want? How do I not reveal this and give them that? Like, what if they aren't all the same? What do they want me to guess? Because maybe I'm missing something, and they're like, well, I think they're all the same. It's pretty obvious. Yeah. And even in the original study, which I really picked up on because I'm reading for this stuff, there's this little comment where they just made a comment, but wasn't tied to any study. It said, it seems as though people can tell that they're, that there should be something where you can tell when you're BSing yourself. And I think that that's also just, we don't bother, that's been understudied, that cognitive sense of, do you trust what you just said? So if you ask people, like, how much do you trust what you just said? So if you look at the false memory research where people induce false memories, like, you can get at this point 95%, you can get people to confess to crimes they didn't commit if you get them to create the model just right and corner them and they can't get out. Brainwashing is not so hard anymore. Chopping people. And so in that literature, you can kind of ask them after the fact, well, how much do you believe in the confession you just gave? And then you start to see all this variability, and you see it starts to fade off. And, so it's also, we have this computer model that we've been taught that we're computers. And so it's like you said, there's your data answer, static, trapped attention, everything's static. It's not a dynamic process. Nobody does science where they talk about these time constants and bleeds, and it's all reductive and messy. And so if you come back in with a model, Ian McGilchrist and so on, if you kind of bootstrap yourself from everything we know, cobble together a better model of the mind and reinterpret that last data, you could, the 20th century data, you can start to separate some of the wheat from the chaff. You can, sometimes there's nuggets in there useful, often the whole thing kind of, or it's demonstrating something else. You're like, look, another experiment of induced confabulation. You know, you can reinterpret it with what you know now. So
a lot of the stuff around open-ended inquiry makes me think of things like the Almas and the Diamond Approach, but also in particular Eugene Gendlin. I don't know how much you paid attention to his work, but he was a student of Carl Rogers who felt very strongly about the psychoanalytic method, but was disappointed that only a small percentage of his patients seemed to be making any progress. And so he set out as his initial project. He became the philosopher of the implicit later in his life. But his original discovery was he wanted to get more like nuanced data from patients to see if he could tell something differently than what was going on in the patients who he thought were succeeding and the ones who weren't. And it turned out that the ones who were doing a kind of creative back and forth between their thinking and what he called the felt sense, a kind of interoceptive, proprioceptive bodily awareness. And so he developed this practice called, I think it was, what was it called? Focusing. Yeah, it was just called focusing, right? Where you're supposed to think of a bunch of the things related to the issue and then get a general sense of the issue and then kind of guess things and then weigh them out viscerally to see if that's the right word. And then if it's not, you throw it away, you try another one, you try one until there's a felt sense of a lock between the two of them. And then you've moved one step forward in your therapy as far as Gendlin was concerned. But the key to doing that is some kind of ability to do interoceptive body sensing, somatic self-awareness a little bit better than people normally do. So I'm curious in the way you think about all this, how important do you think somatic sensing is? Yeah.
Yeah, that's really a great frame. So again, if I were trying to reinterpret that science, and we could have fun with that through what I feel like modern cognitive science lens would be, as not as a practitioner, but as a whatever, somebody who reads too much of it. So I would say that that if I were trying to do that experiment over again and if I could talk to Carl Rogers about it, I would ask if he could reprocess the data to see if people felt under threat, felt any kind of coercion, or felt as though the person presenting the therapeutic model had authority, anything that would have them confabulate. So, this is I don't know if you're aware of the work of Scott Miller, who tries to track, this kind of gets back to the point of like, what do therapists actually do? Scott Miller's written a lot on, he wrote co-authored The Heroic Client, which is kind of a seminal piece. And he does a lot of work on measuring performance of therapists. And his whole model is that there's, better and worse matches, which says a lot. But that client-centered therapy would be basically trying to get out of the way and not interfere with this insight process and not insert your model. And he kind of has told anecdotal story of like, that when he goes to conferences and he asks how many people think they do it, most people say they do. And he says, I guarantee you most people don't. So, but it's not, but how do you tell if a therapist in a session is interpreting what the person, the person's world? And in that case, that would induce a confabulation where people would form a causal relationship and not a felt sense relationship. They just insert that model into their brain. It wouldn't be a felt sense, it's not theirs. So, and I think that also would explain why you have data that would show therapists don't get better with practice and people that are untrained therapists do as well as trained therapists. It's not, according to Scott Miller, they have yet to show that they have any tacit knowledge. They're not a legitimate profession. So we just legitimize them. Insurance companies do, and the academy does for whatever reason. And but they haven't actually been able to demonstrate what their tacit knowledge is in a way that says, well, now we know what it is, let's improve it. So there's a lot to say about that, and so coming back to like, why do we even need therapists is maybe a whole nother can of worms we want to do for another time. But
there's something in there that reminds me of an earlier sort of inquiry here, which is the return or production kind of dynamic, right? Because I think the way I initially phrased it, which is that for whatever reason, the patients have an intelligence, they have a skill, they have a competence above average in being able to check something and do something with they're performing some quasi metacognitive maneuver that may be like a skill development, like walking on a tightrope.
Right.
But the other way to look at it is That's a very natural capacity that may be shut down by certain social and contextual factors, right? And we wouldn't really know unless we had a way to test this, but they're both good hypotheses.
That's right. Yeah. And so like so I would say they could both be true, that we definitely we have to have an intrinsic ability to somatically test things, because we already exercise that. That's what we call our cognitive senses. We say that doesn't add up, or that's, I had an insight. We have insights are somatic, I mean, the insight process is somatic. And but kind of to anchor this a little bit more into maybe a more pointed to more directly to your point, the process of building the Inqwire system was to start with the idea. This is Thomas Metzinger's work, or abstractions, which I think are broader than him, but this is where I discovered them, of making a distinction between cognitively available, and cognitively introspectable. And so the idea is like you walk into a cafe to meet a friend, and all the different people are cognitively accessible. They all seem equal in some way, including your friend. Like they're all the same class to some way of thinking. One of them's introspectively available. The strangers are not. If I start asking, like, what do you think their childhood was like? Or what would you think it'd be like to, spend an afternoon with them? It's like, you kind of know you're making stuff up. You don't have access to that. But I can ask you a lot of open questions about your friend that would be productive, meaning that you can introspect and productively come up with a quality of information that is useful and reliable, because you have an experiential base to inform it. So what you would really want, coming back to one of our earlier discussions, to ground the system, is you'd want to be able to access things that are introspectively available through your tacit knowledge. And you would want to understand the type of inquiry forms that do that. And a way to select for them is through somatics, because they have a different feel. It feels different, and different things happen because you can feel the opening, good feel in yourself, the shift, that you can feel the opening happen with the right questions. And so, and I kind of argue that if you start looking for these things, you kind of see them as the kind of the magic points. When people are guiding processes, they throw out a question that it becomes that, that's happening. It's kind of, or it's not. There's some that are analytic, like, where it's almost the opposite. It's a headachy question. Other ones are, often in interviews it has to be analytic, because the headachy ones you got a quick feedback for too. The open ones are like, whoa, I kind of I'm in a quiet place now. So it's another thing that I think when you had said that, back to the social effect, if you are to ask these certain kind of questions in a social setting where people are free to not answer with words and they can be quiet, collectively, you invite now a way to have both everybody engaged, or collective natural intelligence together, and offer back tacit knowledge, which the nature of, if you have it fully grounded, the nature of it, the narrative does not become confabulatory because it's anchored on first person, but it becomes available for insight process, because you are learning about the direct experience of another person that is sharing your reality, which is what we are completely, starving for right now. We aren't grounded in each other's reality at all. Like, we're grounded in the reality of media and those stories, not in each other's lived experience. So from that frame, the things that would be dissonant in a collisional frame, because we're oppositional, because when does that happen? That happens when our models collide. Our models collide because we've overgeneralized them. And so we're speaking more generally. Like, we could do this right now. We could get into an argument, but then we could carefully deconstruct it into somebody's direct experience. This is where I got my, eventually we'd ground it into what information do you have, and what was that, we could start at collision and we can deconstruct it into grounding. But if we also start with our direct experience, there's no collision. It's just different views on the elephant, and that gives us a broader worldview and greater grounds for compassion and nuance and problem solving and coordination. So the open and question form is a really giant technology, one that does that, one that can stick to introspectively available and not just cognitively available. That, yeah.
You've got, there's this whole set of insights, and accompanying personal practices, and then the ability to convert them into language in certain ways, and the ability to turn that languaging into some kind of digital system that
Right.
could. And what I'm wondering is how much of that is applicable to childhood education, right? Is it a part of just the ongoing self-refinement of adults, or to what degree could it be directly ported into an elementary school system? Or if it can't, how do you think about childhood education?
Right. Oh yeah. Well, those are two big cans of worms. I think it's very appropriate, and we've done limited experiments and love to do more where people do this group process with their families, and the kids like it. It's a little bit. It's interesting within the family if it opens up a can of worms a little bit, so there's a lot of trust. So the feedback we got from the family that did the experiment intimately was that the kids, this is someone who's working with us, so really wanted to try it out, that the kids really liked it and they asked to do more of it. And then there's a 7-year-old and 11-year-old, and the 11-year-old said, if you ever use anything I shared with you here, like out of context, if you ever kind of ruin this process, like I'll never trust you again. Like you can't, they have a great relationship. It's like, don't mess this up, Dad. So I think it might take some family, I don't know if any old family, or any old relationship with kids would, I think that has TBD to be developed, determined if there's like a precondition for
necessary supportive factors for that.
Yeah, especially because of the power dynamics. So, you're neutralizing the power dynamics when you bring in another system to do this. And I think that there's a consent thing. We say huge consent thing where we say to adults, don't say anything you're not comfortable sharing. You don't have to answer. You don't have to share. But I don't know if kids understand how to give that kind of consent in a group thing. That said, as a solitary tool and knowing how to work through things and ask yourself productive questions for kids, I can't see a downside to that because they're very simple, common sense questions. It's just an inventory, and it's back to what you said. It's getting in touch with yourself. It's asking yourself things, and I think that the obvious way to do this would be to partner with somebody who does this in their day job and could evaluate it. These are my first guesses. So we'd want to work with somebody who's really excited about education and excited about it. To me, it could come. It depends. The content you put into it is what makes it safe, right? So if you were to keep it in a group scenario about stuff that's not personal, and you make that boundary clear, like we're just going to use it as a tool to understand the life of Lincoln, or deconstruct a fairy tale, or talk about historical event, or try to understand how something about how societies work. These would all be fair game. But if someone were to take it somewhere personal, that's where I think we should be aware of, can children really test if children really do feel comfortable not answering. And I think that this is actually, it sounds like I'm being super cautious, but like if I see what people are actually doing to kids, I'm shocked. I'm like, this is kind of coercive, and they're volunteering things in these group things that could be used against them and bullied. And, people open up and other people open up. It's a reciprocity thing. And to mess with that, I think that people have not been careful. My own feeling on that is people haven't been careful enough to really understand if children are giving consent to participating in.
I'm guessing that's an
exercises.
enormous factor in the reason why we have the proliferation of the placebo confabulatory left brain mode in the world, right? Is that something goes on in the children where there's very delicate indicators as to whether you should lean more into some kind of authentic incongruity processing, or whether you should lean more heavily into a more socially responsive indifference to your actual experience.
Oh, I don't know if that's true. I mean, I think there's giant swaths of ways. Like I think we can. Well, let me just give you I think that's a reasonable hypothesis that it keeps everything feeling safe and boundaried. I mean, but which boundaries are you protecting? So yeah, there's kind of the protecting the boundary of people being vulnerable and opening up with personal information. But I think more to the point, I mean, when you look at the utility, you know, the obvious incentives with education, right, are to develop a workforce of people that are going to do what they're told and participate in a dead system, doing dead work, and they're not supposed to be challenging and entering an inquiry, being disruptive, and they're not supposed to be participating in a lively way. They're supposed to be participating in a mechanized way. And so we're trying to prepare them for a mechanized world. So we give them a mechanized education. And so that I think it's somewhat accidental. And I'll give you like a thought experiment just to kind of round out how I imagine it could safely work is just something I ended up doing with my sister-in-law was running a school, a non-traditional school. And she had me come in and just talk about flight. And the kids were at age 7 to 16. So it was like one of these really super hippie schools. And I just thought, all right, let's just talk about flight. And I said, well, I fly paragliders and they're like this. And then I threw up a little whiteboard and said, this is a wing and this is Bernoulli's effect. And, you know, it's kind of this and that, and air molecules are doing that, and pressure, and that creates lift. And I just gave a little physics exercise on atmospheric science, fluid dynamics, which is like not normal. It's really hard to grasp, right? And so does anybody, you know, says, okay, so now let's say I have two wing profiles, which one's going to create more lift? And then 7-year-old raises his hand and I'm like, and he picks the right one. I'm like, do you want to explain your answer? He's like, he understood the whole thing, you know, because it was a very grounded lesson. So I was very grounded. I wasn't having him memorize anything. I was just telling stories about kind of how the world works. And then we did an experiment where we made paper airplanes. And I said, what we're going to do is we're going to get in groups and we're going to make paper airplanes and put pennies at the front of the airplane. And then we're going to fly the airplanes. We're going to write down our data of how far the plane goes while we move the penny and where it is positioned in the airplane. And so we did the exercise and everyone wrote down their data. So now move the penny and write down your data. And I said, then we're going to get together in a circle and talk about our results. And the kids are like, okay, so how did the penny affect the flight? And it's just like, and they're like, what are you talking about? Like, we threw it different every time. Like, right. So people call it wasn't a controlled experiment. And like, yeah. And so this isn't enough numbers. Like, right. So they call that statistical analysis is not enough. And they're just explaining the scientific method back to me. And I'm just labeling it. You know, I'm like, okay, how would you, and if you really want to do it, you do it this way. Like, great. That's hypothesis test generation. Like, okay, this is how science works. So, you know, am I going to be able to put them on a bell curve and figure out who's going to go to Cambridge and who's going to go to, you know, those systems are dying. So maybe there's an opening finally to teach you to recognizing that it's very easy to teach people how to learn about the world. They're doing it all the time anyway. And so that would be more, you know, how I'd reimagine science working or education working would be that you can meta label how people are learning already and expose them to things they might want to learn about.
Like that these are the answers to particular problems that we're confronted with now, versus maybe there were ancient cultures who were much better at it than us, right? If it's that easy for kids to generate the scientific method, then couldn't they have done that, you know, barefoot in the forest 10,000 years ago?
I mean, did they need to, right?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we kind of we should be enjoying ourselves, you know. It's like we don't do stuff till it's a problem. So, and then we started corralling things and owning things and making problems for each other, and then yeah. But yeah, it's interesting. Like, did we need science before we had to invent science, or
were there certain people who gave themselves really unique problems, like
right?
Like building Stonehenge was one dude's solution to the idea he couldn't get out of his head, which was, how could I do this?
Right. Yeah. Right.
And no one else cared.
I mean, I gave them a ridiculous problem, right? I mean, they probably just wanted to fly paper airplanes after that. But I said, no, we're going to do this ridiculous experiment. And then they kind of called me out and said, well, why would you do that? And maybe that's the takeaway on all this in 21st century. Everybody's like, why would you do that, science? We got real problems to solve, you know? And I think that's another huge disconnect. How would I reinvent education, the bigger topic? But, you know, how would whales do it? You know, okay, we have to like change bodies. Whales are in humans now. And they're like, what did you guys do? Oh my God. You know, how would you, assuming whales are more intelligent than we are, maybe they're not. But let's take some more intelligent sea creature that doesn't have opposable thumbs and is smart enough to know it doesn't end well when you try to muck with your life support system like this. And it comes in and sees us mad, warring, crazy creatures creating this mess. I think that
this was in what was that book that was really popular last year? The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wengrow.
Oh, I didn't read it.
Like
So you talk about
history book, right? It had a bit of a political leaning to it, but one of the arguments they're making is there were just so many different things tried by the cultures that we consider to be pre-civilized that some of them were, but some of them were also the solutions to problems we hadn't even figured out were problems yet. And we might think of them as primitive customs, but they were actually primitive customs on the far end of having gone through a whole bunch of social problems that we're currently facing.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But I think a lot of Beelzebub tales to his grandson kind of points to that too, with all the timeline manipulations and whatnot for you to consider.
And I love some of your terminology because wiseacring and confabulation, or like, what is Beelzebub's tales except a huge imaginal counterfactual?
Right. Yeah. To get you to try to look for the resonances and the felt sense insights, the somatic, like why is that, how does that associate and what do I think that's about? Well, that's a whole nother discussion that'd be fun to talk about. It's just the tales. But back to this, what do we really need to do here, what would solving our problems really look like? What by reforming education, I assume towards the end of like people that could survive this mess we've created. And the reason I brought up the whale thing was just an experiment of like, here's what we kind of can imagine as a really intelligent species that doesn't seem to do much other than sing and tell stories and everything. And so I think that's one thing that I don't want to seem passive. It's not. It's the pregnant with the dissonance and holding the complexity and being cautious with our actions and a lot of not doing. So maybe more education about, like, there was a challenge I had on Twitter where I was talking to a medical doctor about that. How much of what they do, there should be more mechanisms behind science. And people say, well, look, if you have the stats, it's good enough. Like if you find out washing your hands doesn't create sepsis, wash your hands if you don't understand how it works. And then the counter, and then I'm kind of holding up this counter argument of like, keep the pressure on to figure out how it works. Like, don't give up on figuring out how it works. And this idea that and then the pushback on that was like, we don't even know how most stuff works. And like, yeah, that's a problem. You might be fixing one thing and breaking 100. We'll never know. I don't know if you'll appreciate that, but that absolutely could be happening with all the drugs we're taking, is that we're not going to measure for those 100 other things we broke because we don't know how it works and we don't know how most things work. And we're mucking with everything without knowing how anything works. So I think it's really underappreciated how much it's not a I'm okay with everything non-action. It's like, just stop messing with everything, for Christ's sake. Just stop messing with it and just pay attention to it and try to figure it out for a while. Just pause with the doing and engage with the thought experiments and the understanding. Like, just, stop new technologies, new drugs, new this. Is like, just, could we get a collective sense of like, slow down?
The increasing confrontation with complexity that's been coming to us through the last 50 or 60 years of science makes this obvious that we need things like, Chesterton's fence and the precautionary principle. We have to be a little bit more cautious, and we also have to, when possible, take extra time, right? And it's obvious in interpersonal affairs and things like that. You need a little bit extra time to understand and feel even what your own feelings are, let alone dealing with someone else. But
there's natural time constants. Yeah.
This is always a silly example that comes into my mind, which was the Pepsi challenge, because I was a little kid when I saw this, of blindfolded people drinking Coke and Pepsi and preferring the Pepsi. And then Coke panicked and changed their entire formula to New Coke, which nobody liked. And they had to go to Coke Classic. And so the question was, if people preferred the Pepsi, why did they not like the New Coke? Because they added more salt and sugar, which is what Pepsi had. Turned out it was kind of a time scale issue, right? When you take one sip, you like a lot of sweet, and but if you have to drink a whole can, you don't.
Right. Very good example. That's a great example. And you could look through that lens, right? Just even that lens, which we don't even capture, which is such a huge, if you just want to fix the world by saying, are you assuming this is a static model and not a dynamic model? Like, is your data static? If your data is static and trying to represent a dynamic, non-normal, not normalizable, not normally distributed world, anything you infer from it's garbage, and just even trying to control for that time dimension. There's reinterpreting all the conclusions people have. So there's all this falsity. There's basically, we're bombarded with stuff that's just false. And so, it's slowing down. It's not just to extend the time scale slowing down. It's when you say take time if possible, it's challenging what's possible. And it's knowing what time is needed. Like, there's real cognitive work to be done with real thought experiments we construct that are actually meaningful and articulatable, to start to carefully imagine into, like, how could this be working? What experiments should we be doing? How could possibly people be hurt? What could be the harm? Who should we talk to about that? Who should we ask about that? There's so much doing to be done. It's a fertile, active, exhausting, necessary doing. It's not whoa, let's just slow down and take a chill pill. It's like, no, we actually have to keep moving on this, because these machines are going to keep going.
Yeah.
And we have to actively stop them.
Where the answer is slowing down, it's because of the urgency. It's because we have to get stuff done. That's why we have to slow down a little bit in various ways. Right. It's more urgent. We have to be more productive, and this is how you are more productive.
Yeah, we have
otherwise you're going to miss the richness of the data, so to speak.
We have to stop the doing to challenge the doing. We have to question the doing. We have to question the doing, basically. So I'd say that, if I really want to set my kids up for success, and not being a parent and probably being completely wrong about this, I think
whatever you say next, I'm just going to believe and implement on my children.
There we go. Of course you are. Yeah. You probably already are, though, but should be just like, you're probably safe by just having them ask just that, question the doing. Is that, do you have to do that? Does it have to be done like that? Does that have to work like that? We've got so much momentum in the systems, and just that stepping back to question, does this have to be working like this?
Yeah.
That level, that stance. And if you get it immediately, oh yeah, maybe not, now you can start, well, what then could replace it?
Right. That breaks up that, whatever that something like energy is that narratives have, right? That sort of causal insistency that part of a narrative applies to the next part of a narrative.
Yeah, that basically it optimizes instead of it sacrifices the feasible for the optimal, and it reduces possibilities without us realizing it. Yeah. I'm just optimizing for making the most money. That seems innocent enough, and you've obliterated a giant landscape of meaning that one's fell soup of optimization.
I feel really good, and I would happily keep talking with you for hours. So maybe we should, I think we're pushing the limit of what someone else would listen to at this point.
Right. Yeah.
But let's definitely do another one of these.
Sure,
I'm very happy with this. And if there was one parting message, like if you were speaking to the listener of this podcast, what can they do that would help you, or move things along in the direction you're imagining?
Oh, wow. Thank you for letting me provide an ask. Well, we really want to get we really want to enter into these critical dialogues, and we really like the frame of natural intelligence. We want to run that past people. We also feel as though we can back up a lot of the arguments we put out there. So we'd like to have it be, a little bit of it, like what we just did, a little bit of an argument, a careful argumentative process where I can challenge you can challenge me, and we can be throwing more data out there, that discovery process. So I guess I'd love to hear from people, like if they think that that is a vision for what a community like this could do outside the academy. Like the academy reinvented itself already once, and kind of, I guess I'm curious for this particular audience, which I assume is Metamodern Integral, if anything I said, which is not the normal mode they work in, resonates with where the community thinks it's already going, and hope and facilitates something they already sensed was maybe wanting to happen, maybe legitimizing. That'd be really great if it feels like it legitimizes a direction they already sensed going. And maybe I'm curious if people think that would give it more cohesion and ability to be more productive and actually start to get somewhere with like this discernment distinction process and bringing in science to everything. Like I suppose that's what I'd really love to know from all these people are thinking so hard about all this, of like, could we pull something like that off? And I think the world deserves it. And I think that somebody needs to do it, because the academy is not doing it and not set up right for it. And as part of that, I think there's a lot to figure out to do better than the academy. So I think that the supporting people in updating their maps and their models would be a necessary part that the academy fails at. They say it's your job to be a scientist, which is to prove things are wrong. And then when you're wrong, you're just quietly abandoned, or, like it's a really hostile environment. I don't think it has to be hostile. There's no reason it has to be hostile. So hostile, truth-seeking, collective, natural intelligence environment that moves forward and restoring our capacity to solve our largest problems under the idea that natural intelligence is synonymous with a scientific method, and we could bring in real science into that. And that's my dream.
How does everyone feel about all of that?
What does everyone think about all that? That's it. That's what I'd love to know.